You began to plant the seed in people's minds. But I think in the process, you did create a media image of me that's far beyond, the reality of me.
And this craving, this awful, raging, eating feeling inside. I could feel it consuming my insides. It was overwhelming me.
Hello again and welcome to Serial Killing, a podcast. My name is Elissa Kerrill and I am the researcher, the writer, producer, editor, so on and so forth, all the things. And this podcast is where I cover all things true crime, not just serial killers, because as long as I've been at this, as many years as I've been at this, I just had to expand. And it's okay. It's perfectly fine. So if you are into entire stories of these dangerous people, mostly including and focusing on the childhood experiences and possible genetically inherited issues, the nature versus nurture debate, well, then you have come to the right place, my friends, because that's what I do here. I mean, if you are anything like me, then you do want to know the hows and the whys of people that commit crime, right? So if you are into murder and mayhem with some stories of animal uprising and just general shenanigans, check out my second podcast, Serial Killing, Murder in the News. It's kind of slapstick. We don't take things seriously over there, but it's entertaining nonetheless, or so those listeners tell me. So my BFF is the first and top BFF, but my second BFF is writer and director Ryan Murphy. Don't believe me? Well, every time he releases a new monster series, my listenership spikes exponentially. Dahmer, the Menendez brothers, and now he's about to release his new monster series called Monster, the Ed Gein Story. And when I heard that he was making it, I heard it like back months and months ago, it made me a little nostalgic for old Ed. So I decided to go back through all of my notes from the hundreds of episodes that I've written out for each episode before recording to read my good old Ed Gein episode. But I was actually a little surprised when I realized I'd never done a full episode on him. I know, right? The episode I did was a Behind the Horror episode, which talked about the true story behind the movie A Texas Chainsaw Massacre. So I did do a brief summation of Ed. When I tell you that it brought an old familiar joy to my heart to know that that meant I could cover him as if I'd never had, guys, I was a happy auntie. So please, allow me to be the one to refresh your memory of Ed Gein's story before Ryan's series is dropped so that you can go in knowing the true story. I mean, we all know Ryan takes a teeny bit of creative license, but we love him. But I just want you guys to have the actual information going in so that you can just enjoy his creative license that he thusly takes. I thought, quite honestly, that he needs to cool it with poor Evan Peters. But that's a whole other thing, right? So Ed Gein was known as the Butcher of Plainfield. So let's get into his story. I'm so excited. Okay. So Edward Theodore Gein was born in La Crosse County, Wisconsin, which shares a border with Minnesota, on August 27th, 1906. As we sometimes do, let's kind of get a feel for what the world was like when he was born, what kind of stressors maybe his mother might have been under while she was pregnant, global events. We know that affects the pregnancy. So in New York, in 1906, there was a landslide that killed 21 people. The first service was held at African Methodist Episcopal Church in Los Angeles by W.J. Seymour in a series later known as the Azusa Street Revival, an event which launched the Pentecostal movement in Christianity, or what we from the southern United States call Pentecostal. The San Francisco earthquake, the famous San Francisco earthquake, struck, scoring a 7.8 on the Richter scale. It killed thousands of people and left people in the hundreds of thousands homeless. I mean, the city itself was nearly destroyed. Also in 1906, heir to a multi-billion-dollar railroad fortune, Harry K. Thaw, decided to shoot and kill architect Stanford White at the Roof Garden Theater of Madison Square Garden. The significance of that is that Madison Square Garden was designed by the victim, Stanford White, okay, in New York City. So there were race riots in Atlanta, Georgia, where nearly 30 people lost their lives. The frickin' Panama Canal was still under construction in 1906, guys. And then just, like a handful of notable people born this year, although probably 70% of you are going to know who these people are and 30% aren't, but I wouldn't mention them if they didn't hold some significance. So look them up, have some fun. But born the same year as Ed, we've got Lou Costello, Josephine Baker, great singer, George Sanders, Joan Crawford, who was the actress that the movie Mommy Dearest was made about, and then of course Ed Gein was born in 1906. So Ed's parents were George Gein and Augusta Wilhelmine Lerk, Lehrka Lerk. So let's start with Ed's father, George Philip Gee, spelled G-E-E, born back in 1873 in Vernon County, Wisconsin. George's mother had hailed from Germany and his father had been born in Ontario, Canada. So Ed's paternal grandparents, George's parents, had lived on a farm in Wisconsin near the Mississippi River. George was one of 3 children, a brother and a baby sister, along with himself. So when that sister was only 1 year old, George was 3 years old. His parents and infant sister were swept away in a flash flood from the Mississippi River, and they died. Their bodies were never found. This meant that Ed's father and his uncle were orphaned, and they had to be given to their mother's brother and wife to finish raising them. At some point, George, again, this is Ed's father, George changed his last name or began using the new last name of Gein, which I suspect might be a combination of his father's last name of Gee and the end of Diegeldine, which it was the last name of his uncle and aunt. It ended in E-I-N. So he combined Gee with the E-I-N and became Gein. That's what I think. George married Augusta in December of 1900. So now we need to get into Augusta's prior existence to Ed. So we're going to talk about Mom. Augusta Wilhelmine Lerk was born in July 1977, 4 years younger than her husband. She was the 6th child out of 12, so quite literally the middle child, right, to German immigrant parents in La Crosse, Wisconsin. Her parents had been amongst the mass exodus out of Prussia, if you will. Her family was also Lutheran, and not just Lutheran. Seriously, intensely, probably unwaveringly believed that the earth was only 4,000-ish years old, kind of intensely Lutheran. They called it Old Lutheran. She was raised to believe that every human thought was tainted by sin. Every human action was infected with immoral motives. She was taught that every single person in existence deserves to go to hell. I could not find out how the two met, but again, George and Augusta married in December of 1900. Augusta had been 22, George had been 25, 26. Their first son, Henry George Gein, was born in January of 1901. I'm giving you a moment to soak that in, okay? I verified Henry's birth month and year via several mainstream sites and sources, as well as Mr. Google, all of the trustworthy sources, even Ancestry.com. Verified his birth. There were a couple that said he was born in 1902, but those are incorrect. But I wanted to address that because I figure I would have heard about it. He was born January 17th precisely, 1901. With that said, did you notice Augusta and George's wedding date of December of 1900 and Henry's birth in January of 1901? Yeah, see, there it goes. It's blooming in your mind, isn't it? Right? Never. In my lifelong studying of all of these cases and all of these things, just endless books, documentaries, have I ever caught that until this moment. Again, I verified the dates, Ancestry.com, census, what have you. They have him born in January of 1901. So this means that Augusta was pregnant when she and George married. So just take a moment to let that sink in, guys. And those of you that are very familiar with Augusta, you're already gasping. You're already gasping. Pull over. Don't cause a car accident. Get up from the couch. Go get you a drink of water. Hydration is important. Yes, guys. She was pregnant. 8 months pregnant. With Henry. Augusta Gein was with child at her own wedding. How am I the only one that I've heard at this point find that out? I mean, the significance of this, guys. Those of you who are new to Ed Gein, though, and his kind of nutty mother in this whole situation, buckle in. Because this shit gets deep. Okay. So, then of course, Ed was born in August of 27th, 1906, making Henry 5 when Ed was born. So, Augusta opened a grocery store / butcher shop in La Crosse, Wisconsin, the year that Ed was born. I had a hard time tracking down the name of her store, but one source local to the area said it was called Gein and Lurk Grocer, which was Augusta's maiden name, and it was said the store was owned by and ran by George and another man, most likely one of Augusta's brothers, but make no mistake, she ran the store. George himself worked as a tanner and a carpenter for the railroad. He also worked, for a time, at the local power plant, and he even once worked for the fire department. But George was known to be a pretty bad alcoholic, and he had a hard time maintaining jobs for any real length of time. Augusta would, of course, have zero patience with this, considering her upbringing, and she began to resent her husband. Resentment turned into near loathing, but again, her beliefs meant that divorce would never be an option. So she would cope by belittling George in front of their young sons. And it was also said that Augusta had wished for a daughter when she had Ed. Augusta's disgust with her husband began to grow outwardly to include pretty much all men. And with little Ed, well, she began to hyper-focus on him. She was very overbearing and also very overprotective of him in his early years, and really his whole life. But the early years were intense. She'd be damned if he would turn out useless like every other man in her life, right? Not my personal belief. So there is a story that when his parents were slaughtering a pig out back behind the store, 7-8-year-old Ed's body had a sexual response. So there is that. And the fact that he was in that 7-8-year-old range is just further data for kind of an opinion that I'm forming that I will share with you guys later. Some of you may have heard about it, but I digress. Augusta kind of got to her breaking point, and believing La Crosse, Wisconsin was just a morally corrupt nest of sin, and seeing that her husband just wasn't going to be climbing any career ladders anytime soon, she made a very big decision. She sold the store and used that money to buy a farm in Plainfield, Wisconsin, and a little bit left over to get him started. In 1915, when Ed was around 9 and Henry would have been about 14, she decided to buy the remote farm to distance herself and her family, but most importantly her sons, from the very society that she saw as wicked and perverse. And when I say that this was a remote farm, I mean every bit of that word. While figures do vary, albeit slightly, the consensus is that Augusta had purchased a farm on, give or take, around 200 acres. For most average people that have never lived on a giant farm, that is an incredible amount of land. It was far, far more than they would need to sustain themselves. Their nearest neighbor was around 1 mile away. I had a hell of a time trying to find out exactly what kind of farming that the Geins did, but it all just sort of said, in so many words, that they were homesteaders, and most of us know exactly what that is. but for those who might not be familiar. Homesteaders, just quickly, are people who do exactly what the Geins did. They buy a farm or some land, they build it up so that they can be fully self-sufficient. The end goal is fully off the grid, fully self-sufficient. That would be things like raising chickens for meat and eggs, perhaps having a few cows for milk and meat, a pig, a nice big vegetable garden. You canned your own food, you preserved your own things of this nature. Ed began school in the area, and it was said that that was really the only outside, off-the-farm activity that he was ever allowed to have. At school, the kids bullied him because he had a drooping eyelid that made him look like he had what they called a lazy eye, but it was just a little growth on his eyelid. But in the grand scheme of things, school was still a bit of an escape for young Ed, and it was said that he was a very strong reader and that he read constantly. He was considered an average student, but a great reader. He was very shy when interacting with his peers, and this was a bit off-putting to the other kids. He also had a teeny bit of a speech impediment due to a lesion on his tongue, so again, he didn't easily fit in. And remember, this is the very early 1900s, and his school was all of 12 kids total, representing every grade. They called those one-room schoolhouses. So he could be bullied by a high schooler, and they're in the same room. That would be intense and kind of scary. So Ed wanted to make friends, though, and when he would actually try, get out of his comfort zone, Augusta would severely punish him or gaslight the shit out of him with her extreme religiosity, and he wouldn't attempt friendships any further. Augusta, again, was extremely religious, and her constant preaching at her boys about how evil the world had become was never ending. Imagine growing up in that. You have no free will to think on your own at all. It's just, this is the truth, this is what you believe, do not question it, there is no other thought, and you will obey, right? But you still deserve hell and all of this hellfire and brimstone every single day of your life, into middle-agehood, quite honestly. Augusta drilled into her sons' minds that all women were whores of the devil. She read violent passages from the Old Testament in the Bible to her sons every single day. And where was their father? Well, George himself had little to do with his boys' upbringing, actually, other than beating them excessively as a form of discipline. It was probably the only useful thing that Augusta said he was good at or good for. So as Ed continued in school, right, Ed was still very shy and he was withdrawn. He would also sort of burst out laughing randomly during class. To his peers, he seemed a bit feminine, which spurred on the local bullies, as we all know it would have. Another childhood incident happened when his father beat him about his head so severely that his ears began to ring. But what had young Ed done that was so bad that he deserved that? Good question. He had received this beating about his head, around and on his head, because he had come home from school crying due to the bullies at school. Then the icing on top would be Augusta telling Ed, and Henry wasn't immune either, keep that in mind, that both were going to grow up to be useless, just like their father. So when Ed was 12, he was taking a bath, and his body was beginning to respond, as they do at this age, to stimulation. Right? He's cleaning it. Hey, this feels good, so on and so forth. Except his mother just stalked in on him while he was doing that in the bathtub. She shoved her hand down into the water and violently grabbed his genitals, exclaiming that they were the, quote, curse of man. Augusta would force her sons to promise that they would remain virgins because sexual intercourse would lead to their very damnation, coming from a woman who was knocked up before marriage. So in 1920, at just 14 years old, Ed graduated from the 8th grade, and then he promptly dropped out. But it's important to know that back then, this was not wholly uncommon, especially kids who lived on large farms, because they were relied upon by their parents to help with the farm for everyone's survival. His mother continued to verbally basically field strip him and belittle his father, and during his teen years, Ed developed an increasingly intense attachment to Augusta, because where was he going to throw his love due to all of his hormones and puberty at? What girls? Right? He started kind of playing into it. He began to agree with her that men were indeed weak, though he was, keep in mind, maturing into one himself. In turn, she put forth great effort to convince her sons that only she was a strong and virtuous woman, and the only woman who deserved her sons' love and devotion. Again, knocked up before marriage back then. Nobody really cares now. And so, guys, that was Ed's childhood. Okay, let's take a look. Now, can I just say, aside from the science that we're about to get into, right, this is just sort of a sidebar thing, that the literal horrific San Francisco earthquake happened only a few months before Ed's birth, landslides killing people, the birth of the Pentecostal movement, where religious people decided to up the ante on the group delusion with speaking in tongues and dancing and exercising of the spirit, some crazy Manson gibberish and dancing around. All of this around the time of his birth somehow seems a little fitting. First and foremost, there is some generational trauma in the genes here, right? George lost his parents, an infant sister, in a flood when he was little. He was raised by an aunt and uncle. There really isn't much further information about George's younger life, really, until he met Augusta. I'm also going to call it and say that Augusta herself also experienced religious trauma, because telling any very small child that their very existence is sinful and they deserve hell is trauma, flat out. It's unacceptable, and I personally think no one should force any religion on their children until the child can decide if they want to follow their parents' faith, or else it isn't free will. Not that it ever was, but that's a whole other podcast. So Ed did have the typical distant, physically abusive, but emotionally distant, alcoholic father who must have decided that being quiet and staying out of her way was the easiest way to deal with his wife. Can you blame him, really? He was there to be her verbal punching bag, and he took his frustrations out on beating his two sons. Ed's radically religious mother, who perpetually preached to her sons about the sins of man and how all women were whores, demanded complete loyalty to her only because only she was without sin, and therefore the only one worthy of their love. But, and I know it's like beating a dead horse, being married in December of 1900, having a baby in 1901, January of 1901, meaning she was pregnant before marriage, goes completely against what she preached. How aware of that was Ed? I mean, was that rather scandalous bit of info a topic that was never to be out in the open? It's an interesting thought, and it also goes in the vein of her grabbing his genitals at 12 years old while he was aroused, if you will, and this is similar to the Green River Killer, aka Gary Ridgway, in that it is vitally important that sons do not see their mothers as sexual creatures. Let me explain. The emotional attraction that a young son feels for his mother is instinctual, emotional, not sexual, okay? The mother becomes the gold standard for comparison, even if she isn't the best mother in the world. Mother-son relationships are complex, and how that presents often greatly impacts the son as he navigates his journey into manhood. In fact, the impact boys deal with as a result of being raised by a critical mother determines how he interacts with others throughout his life. I believe Ed experienced an intense, and this is in quotes, mother wound. A mother wound is when the mother is emotionally unavailable, critical, or not attuned to the child's needs, and it causes trauma. Children's ability to regulate attention, emotion, and arousal develops in the context of their primary caregiving relationships during infancy with their mothers, and appears to be fundamental for the balance of organizing behavior, social relationships, and adaptive functioning. A mother wound can be caused by moms not allowing their child to express negative emotions, or they were extra critical, or expected the child's support with their own physical or emotional needs, and or wasn't available to the child either because they had to work or because they were busy with their own interests. Do note, however, this is sidebar, you can be a working mom, even a working single mom, without instilling the mother wound, okay? Just putting that right out there. So where the wires got crossed with Ed is that, due to really classical conditioning in its most grotesque form by his mother Augusta, she became the only acceptable and good and virtuous woman to exist. She verbally and at the same time brutally conditioned him to believe that all women were harlots, whores of Satan, and only she was pure, even though, again, the pregnancy. She grabbed his erect genitalia with her bare hands while he had been having an innocent kind of self-exploration session, which is completely normal for boys that age. I cannot even imagine. That would be a hugely shameful and yet arousing situation for him, right? That would have most assuredly caused trauma in that moment. Again, think Gary Ridgway, whose mother did pretty much the same thing, only she was just helping wash it, right? Then Augusta preached about how worthless men were, to the point that I feel Ed most likely connected his own maleness with weakness and most likely didn't even want to be male. And it's not like he was allowed to talk and ask questions with his peers about any of his confusion, because she forbade him from having any friends whatsoever, or else the abuse would intensify. It simply was easier to just be quiet, do nothing but go to school and spend every other spare moment with his devoted and loving mother. But, creating social relationships is central to a person's well-being, learning the joy of friendships and societal rules. Experiencing social behaviors, watching and learning and engaging in social interaction outside of your own family is critical, guys, for healthy child development. The absence of this has been shown to affect child development in very serious ways. Socially isolated children tend to have lower educational success, generally are in the group of less advantaged social class in adulthood, and are much more likely to be psychologically distressed. A quote from noisolation.com stated, quote, "The primary function of the human stress response is to protect the body from the environment. When a person is socially isolated, as it is a basic human need, the body will perceive the situation as a threat. During the time of the active stress response, the brain will release multiple stress hormones to protect the body from danger. The release of these hormones is needed for the person to react towards the current stress factor and resist the possible harm. However, the body cannot release these stress hormones and protect the body from stressful situations for an unlimited amount of time. Having an active stress response over an extended period has been proven to increase the risk of developing cardiovascular disease, elevated blood pressure, infectious illness, and then cognitive deterioration." Put a pin in that, cognitive deterioration, and mortality, meaning death. So these are the physiological consequences of being prone to stress over time, and they are typically experienced in adulthood. High levels of stress are therefore regarded as a threat to a socially isolated child's health, not only in their early years of life, but also in adulthood. End quote. That was a mouthful, but you get it. Now, studies of social isolation have shown that Ed's particular level of isolation negatively impacted the development of the brain's overall structure. There is a deficit in the communication chains in a certain type of cells. This is getting kind of deep. These cells had impaired neuron-to-neuron communication in the prefrontal cortex, according to experiments. Now, folks, if you've been with me for a while or know a bit about the brain, having any impairment to the prefrontal cortex is a bad time. It's the part of the brain associated with a variety of cognitive functions, such as planning kind of complex cognitive behavior, higher than just normal animals, higher thought processes, moderating social behavior, decision making, and so on. It's mentioned that Ed's father beat him and hit him in the head so severely that his ears would ring. This was most likely trauma-induced tinnitus. After sustaining a mild traumatic brain injury, most of the brain's energy is diverted to basic functioning and little is left over for filtering or censoring information. Trivial or insignificant thoughts may often have the same weight in your mind as important ones, which can make making decisions more difficult. People may find that their minds get stuck on an idea or a phrase that keeps replaying, and this uses a great deal of brain injury. I had my head through a windshield way back in the day and was picking shards of glass out of my scalp for a bit, and I've often wondered, because I have that sort of ideas and things get stuck on loop in my brain over and over and over. Digressing again. And then we have Augusta's religious beliefs spilling over into socially isolating her sons, shoving scripture down their throats nonstop, and her even, we can call it for what it is, basically sexually assaulting her prepubescent son and stating his genitalia was the sin of man, part of his body that he cannot help. Science has found a link between mania and hyper-religiosity. I personally believe some of Augusta's behaviors seem to at least match the criteria for hyper-religiosity or religious delusions. I personally believe some of Augusta's behaviors seem to be, or at least match the criteria for this. It is a psychiatric disturbance in which a person experiences intense religious beliefs that interfere with normal functioning, such as work and social needs. And then, of course, the incessant need to indoctrinate her children. But basically what we have here is a boy who was uprooted, and we've talked a lot about how that negatively impacts children. He was then moved onto a very remote farm, taught that anyone outside of Augusta was basically unacceptable. He was bullied by other kids at school for being socially underdeveloped, not super masculine, and possibly had a slight speech impediment. He had hellfire and brimstone shoved down his throat his entire life, and yet the only real socialization and attention he got was from his mother. He saw her as a rather angelic figure, nearly godlike in his eyes. So as another sidebar, I want to reiterate the fact that I think that women, though I do understand the plight and the argument being that I am of a female variety, need to cool it, chill out with the constant degrading of men on social media and stuff too, because you have sons coming up listening to you. Do you want to release into the world more Ed Geins with that kind of confusion? I'm a man, but all men are worthless. It's just a point. This isn't political. It's just a point I wanted to make. All right, so let's get back into it. So for the rest of Ed and his older brother Henry's young adult years, they avoided any person outside of their household, of course, to appease their mother, and had only each other for any level of a kind of peer-to-peer friendship. The years just went by. Then in 1940, George died. At 66 years old, he had developed a fluid buildup on his lungs as a complication from pneumonia. Ed was 34 years old at this point. And rather than, at the very least, allowing his sons to have some level of grieving or even a moment for adjustment, Augusta promptly told the boys that their father had been worthless and weak, and that is what has killed him. She drove home that he was burning in hell where he belonged. Fantastic thing to say to men about their father. And time kept ticking by. The years and years went by. Now, Ed and Henry took it upon themselves to work odd jobs around the, nearby small town to make extra money, and thus they were actually kind of forced to socially interact. And oddly enough, the locals found Ed and Henry to be quite odd, of course. The family were basically recluses, right? But they liked Ed and Henry. Local parents even asked Ed to babysit their children, which he was happy to do because he found that he got along with children very well. He and his brother Henry were considered very trustworthy and well liked in town. He never touched any of the kids, just answer that right now. In 1942, Ed had to travel to Milwaukee to get a military draft physical, which I'm sure both terrified and exhilarated him. So this was like 3 years before the end of World War II. He failed only due to his eyelid situation, right? And promptly returned home to the farm. This would be the furthest Ed Gein would ever be from home. And then it was kind of around this time when Henry began dating okay guys, now sit down for this, clutch your pearls, ready? Henry began dating a divorced single mother of 2 children from town. Oh my God. Henry also, suddenly began to make sort of under his breath kind of critical remarks about their mother's utter control over them. Henry kept pushing and then started expressing concern about Ed's attachment to their mother as well, and spoke with Ed on occasion about it, which upset Ed very much. Can you imagine how very upsetting that would have been for Ed, that his own brother was talking shit? In the spring of 1944, so the year before World War II was even over, Ed and Henry were out on the property doing the necessary chores around the farm, burning off some brush on the property when the fire got out of control. The fire department saw the smoke from a distance and they came to assist, and then once the fire was safely out, Ed stated, his brother was missing. They began searching for Henry, but curiously, Ed led them straight to 43-year-old Henry's body, which was located lying face down with no visual burns on his body, and later the medical examiner stated that Henry actually did have bruising on his head. And though it was suspicious, the police did not believe there had been foul play. They ruled that he had died from smoke inhalation, basically asphyxiation. And then just like that, 38-year-old Ed and Mommy Augusta were the only ones left in the house. Convenient. Take a moment to think about that. Ed was on the younger side of being a middle-aged man at this point. He'd never experienced any real social connection with anyone outside of his family, and now his father was gone, and his brother was gone. There was only one person in the whole wide world that he had now, in his own mind, and that was his mother. And then not long after Henry's death, the now 67-year-old Augusta had her first stroke and had to be hospitalized. And once she was able to return home, she immediately noticed that Ed was reading books about human anatomy and grave robbing and how to shrink heads. Now, here's where I will actually give her a 1/4 point of respect, because any mother would be concerned about that. It concerned her, and she let Ed know under no uncertain terms that it was completely unacceptable. You will not consume that kind of material. Then, within the next year, Augusta died. Ed was understandably and utterly beside himself, completely devastated. Augusta was literally the only love he felt he had ever had. To him, she was his one true love. He now felt completely alone. He didn't know what to do with himself and his anguish, so he began boarding up the room that she had occupied, leaving it completely untouched. He really only utilized one small room off of the kitchen and then the kitchen itself. There wasn't really any family money or inheritance, and Ed had to do something, so he attempted to support himself by continuing to do handiwork for the townspeople. Having to raise beef or chicken and keep track of eggs in a vegetable garden by yourself enough to overwinter in Wisconsin would be tough, to say the least. So he had to go and find some work. But it didn't take long for Ed to be living in squalor, and he also began reading the violent and graphically depicted comic books that his mom said were a no-no. He became interested in crime magazines that talked about cannibalism and the Nazi death camps, which was still very raw in people's minds at that time. I mean, World War II had just ended. The people of Plainfield noticed his appearance was becoming more unkempt. They stated the smell emanating from him was bad. 2 years after losing the last of his family, Ed was intensely lonely. He began to have some hallucinations, which scared him, so he started going to visit his mother's grave late at night. The more he visited, the more he did not want to go back home. So one night, he decided to dig up his mother's grave. He then twisted off her head to detach it, to take home, and to attempt to shrink it, as he had read in the books. After that, he began visiting many cemeteries in what was described as a, quote, dazed state, sometimes doing nothing, other times digging up the fresh corpses of middle-aged women that reminded him of his mother that he read about in the obituaries. And once Ed got the bodies home, he would self-service over them, if you know what I mean. He later claimed he never attempted to penetrate the bodies due to the odor, but he did remove the breasts, the nipples, the genital area, and other parts of the body, which still put him under the classification of necrophilia. Now, Ed had decided that he wanted gender reassignment surgery, to be a woman, but in the mid-1950s, there just wasn't really any feasible way for him to do that. So he skinned the bodies of the dead women he dug up. He processed the skin to preserve it and began making himself a woman suit, right? He would then put the skin suit on late at night and walk around the farm pretending to be a woman, or really pretending to be his mother, under the moonlight. So in 1951, the now 45-year-old Ed went into a nearby pub owned by a woman named Mary Hogan. Mary reminded Ed of his mother, and yet Mary was well known for her foul mouth and wild living, which Ed's mother would not have tolerated on any level. But Ed was transfixed. 3 years later, Mary Hogan disappeared from her pub. Police found a pool of blood on the floor and an empty bullet shell. Of course, this became the talk of the town, and Ed would tell people, quote, "She's not missing, she's hung up at the house." People chuckled and dismissed his statements. Oh, Ed, come on. Ed was a good man, if only a bit of an oddball. In just 3 short years, they would not be dismissing Ed as just a harmless oddball anymore. In 1957, Ed walked into a store called Warden's, run by Bernice Warden, to ask her and her son about the price of antifreeze. As most of us know, again, winters in Wisconsin can be harsh. On this particular day, most of the men in town were out deer hunting. So the next day, it was noticed that the Warden's store was locked and that the company truck was gone. The police came, they entered the store to find Bernice was missing. They did find blood on the floor. Bernice's son looked, and the last receipt written was for antifreeze for who? Yeah, Ed Gein. The police knew exactly where to start their search and began making their way to Ed's house. Nothing could possibly prepare them for what they would stumble upon in that old farmhouse. The sheriff entered Ed Gein's house through what they used to call the summer kitchen, which was like a shed built onto the house. There was no electricity in Gein's house, so of course the room was dark. The sheriff's shoulder bumped into something hanging from the ceiling, and when he turned his flashlight around to see what it was, to his horror, he realized that it was a human woman who had been hung upside down and dressed like a deer. Gutted, cleaned, and, let's say, released from the weight of her own head. Right? So she had been slit from her bottom, between her legs, and up her abdomen and chest. I am not going to show a picture of that. If you're watching the visuals of this, you can Google and see that yourself. I don't want to get banned. It's pretty graphic. I will give you that warning. So just take a moment to imagine walking into someone's darkened house and finding a all but head woman hanging upside down, dressed like a deer. Dressed meaning prepared, the, viscera and whatnot already removed. The sheriff and his backup entered the rest of the house, only to find the house was not really in a livable condition. Ed was indeed living in filth. They also found a treasure trove of the most macabre collection of different parts of the body in different stages of dismemberment and preparation for being used as tools. So, thought I'd give you a list of what they found. Okay, they found 4 noses, human bones, tons of human bones and fragments, bone fragments, 9 masks of human skin, bowls made from human skulls, 10 female heads with the tops sawed off, human skin covering several chair seats, Mary Hogan's head in a paper bag, Bernice Warden's head in a burlap sack, 9 outer female genitalia in a shoebox, skulls on his bedposts, organs in the refrigerator, a pair of lips on a drawstring for a window shade, a belt made from human female nipples, a lampshade made from the skin from a human face, and on and on. So after Ed Gein was arrested, he admitted to shooting and killing bar owner Mary Hogan. Keep in mind that she was running a business, right? What did his mom do? During the questioning, the sheriff became so upset, he slammed Ed's head and face into the wall, thus making his confessions inadmissible. That sucks, but that would have been tough. The sheriff had been so utterly traumatized that it affected his health from then on. He actually died from a heart attack before Ed's trial even began. Many stated Gein killed him just as if he had laid his own hands on him. In 1957, during the trial, Gein pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity and was taken to Central State Hospital for the criminally insane to be observed and evaluated until he could be found mentally fit to stand trial. Ed Gein was found fit enough to stand trial in 1968 when he was 62 years old. In 1958, so when he was 52, the Gein house burned down by undetermined means. Most say someone burned it down to stop the flow of curious people driving through their tiny town looking for the House of Horrors. And honestly, if I were a local, I don't blame them. When Ed found out the house was burned, he said, quote, "just as well." His car was then auctioned off for $760, which is the equivalent of about $6,000 today, to a carnival sideshow. Ed, of course, had used his car to haul the dead corpses from the cemeteries to his home. The people that worked in the asylum Gein resided in said he was a model patient, polite, he was courteous, he kept to himself. The other inmates reported that, sometimes during a full moon, he would look as though he were in a trance and would be kind of mumbling to himself. But ultimately, Ed Gein died of respiratory failure in 1984 when he was 78 years old, and he was buried next to his mother. Okay, so experts back then labeled him as a schizophrenic and a sexual psychopath, but we know that they threw the schizophrenic diagnosis around like crazy back then. A Dr. E.F. Schubert found that Ed had a quote, abnormally magnified attachment to his mother. Duh. Ed would begin to weep and talk about how wonderful Augusta was, demonstrating how much he loved and cared for her. Ironically, though, all of Ed's confirmed and known victims resembled his mother on some level. Really, both of the women there at the end owning shops like his mother had, revealing his secret hate and loathe towards his mother. And Augusta had purposefully ensured that they would be so secluded and remote, no one could taint their relationships, but she only succeeded in making them all pathologically codependent on each other. Her overbearing and rigid nature, along with her clear favoritism for Ed over Henry, caused him to become overly sensitive and emotional. And as bad as she spoke about Henry, along with Henry, God forbid, questioning Augusta's authority on any level, I believe Ed murdered his brother. And after her stroke, he became her sole caregiver. More indoctrination, but I'm sure he was just happy as shit. In his childhood, he had witnessed his mother disembowel a hog that was hanging up, the intestines spilling onto the floor while his father watched. At 8 years old, his mother had given quite the visual, and she had played a dominant role in that hog's slaughter. His body responded, but imagine what that did to his psyche. He was emotionally abused by his mother, being made to believe he would never be acceptable because he was a man, doomed to be useless like his father. He was physically abused by his father, who nearly didn't even bother to acknowledge his existence, outside of the beatings, of course, and no warmth or any bond. His psychological growth was severely stunted. This is quite apparent to me. Women were whores of the devil, but he was attracted to them. A swirling tornado of confusion and nowhere to go to compare information with peers to determine his personal opinions and make decisions. Only Augusta, only hellfire and brimstone. No free thought. So right out of the gate, I do not think that Ed Gein had gender dysphoria at all. I get why people say that because he thought about gender reassignment. I do not think he had gender dysphoria. I think that his mother poisoned his mind and made him think being male was unacceptable. And she was basically God, right? And he just wanted to be her after she died. And I don't think it needs to be any more complicated than that. He made the suit, he wore it pretending to be her because he was obsessed with her. I don't think he wanted gender reassignment surgery. Clearly we have Ed in the throes of the Oedipus complex, right? Most of us know about this, but again, for those who don't, this is a Freudian psychoanalytic view where psychoanalysts interpret Gein's actions through the lens of wanting to kill the males in his world so that he could be alone with his beloved mother. His extreme attachment to Augusta and hostility towards his brother could be seen as the ultimate manifestation of this psychological conflict. His inability to overcome this phase led to violent and antisocial behavior as a way to resolve his kind of like deep-seated desires and inner conflicts. Okay? Ed Gein's violence towards his female victims after his mother's death was seen as him regaining his own power and control. Having been victimized and dominated by Augusta, he turned his hatred and envy toward other women to regain a sense of agency. But his official diagnosis of schizophrenia is correct, in my opinion, of course. Augusta was clearly experiencing religious delusions because the term delusion refers to a strong, consuming belief in something that is not true. Religious delusions are associated with certain psychiatric disorders, such as schizophrenia or other conditions that alter a person's mental state. A person's immediate social and family environment can influence religious delusions, and these delusions can affect people even if they are not religious. The studies on this are fascinating. Now, some of you might disagree with me, but the symptoms of religious delusions are things like an unshakable belief in something that there is zero evidence showing that it's true. Grandiose beliefs, the extreme belief in guilt and deserving severe punishment, extreme emotional responses to religious topics, withdrawing from social life, and displaying defensive behaviors in response to someone trying to reason with them. It's the defensive behaviors for me. That's Augusta all day long. I don't think that she was schizophrenic, though, fully. But it is absolutely possible that the gene was there and, due to Ed's utter isolation, codependency, the, again, hellfire and brimstone day-to-day existence he was in, mixed messages from his mother, the gaslighting, the overwhelming and crushing pressure from her, knowing he would never be able to live up to her standards, and boom. He didn't show any signs or symptoms in his youth, but as he got up into his late 20s and 30s, he began to show signs, and then when Augusta died, he snapped. After her death is when the hallucinations began, where he would hear his mother ordering him to do things and had visual hallucinations in the form of his mother being in the room with him. This is all just exactly what they pulled for the movie series Psycho, or for you younger guys, Bates Motel. Norman Bates is heavily based on Ed Gein. Ed Gein's loneliness and inability to cope with his mother's death triggered a psychotic break from reality. This led to a mix of delusions and hallucinations, including the belief that he could bring his mother back to life by creating a, quote, woman suit from the bodies of women who resembled her, and then he, her son, wearing that suit because he represented her, because he was a part of her. You understand this? So that is the story of Ed Gein before Mr. Ryan Murphy releases the story of Ed Gein. And I want to know what you think about this story. Those of you that are really familiar with this, it's kind of old hat at this point. I would still love to know if you have new additional thoughts on this case. But those of you that are not totally familiar with Gein, we've got some true crime babies in the listener group, and we will be sweet to them. We all started somewhere. Then this is a good introduction and a good thing for you to listen to before you watch Ryan Murphy's show, so that you know what actually happened, and then you can just kind of enjoy his interpretation. But I definitely want to know your thoughts and feelings about this case. So leave me a comment. If you really want to support me and help me, and I don't want your money if you don't have it, then just like it and share it. It helps so much. But as always, thank you so much for listening, because I know you could be listening to anyone else, but you chose me, and I really appreciate that, guys. Thank you so much. Have a great day.
Anybody who killed more than 2 or 3 people was a mass murderer, and whether it was all at one place or over an extended period of time. And then in the early 80s, they came up with this differentiation called serial killing.